In 1872, enough money was extracted from the federal government of the United States to build an entire American city from the ground up. Not borrowed, not allocated through congressional appropriation, not distributed through any mechanism that the public was informed about or that any regulatory body had authorized. Extracted. Through a scheme so precisely engineered for concealment that two separate congressional investigations, both armed with subpoena power, both interviewing the same principals, both examining the same institutional records, produced detailed reports that named names and documented mechanisms and resulted in exactly 0 criminal convictions and the recovery of exactly $0. The money was somewhere. Capital of that magnitude does not dissolve. It becomes land and railroads and banks and the foundations of fortunes that outlast the men who built them. But where it went specifically, which assets it purchased, which institutions it funded, which families it established, that accounting has never been produced. Not because nobody tried, because the trail was buried before the investigators arrived, and the census that might have allowed researchers to reconstruct it was destroyed before anyone thought to look. I found this while researching the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is one of those historical events that every American history course mentions in a single paragraph and then drops before anyone examines what actually happened beneath the surface of the bribery story that the official account treats as the whole story. The surface story is familiar enough. A construction company called Credit Mobilier of America overcharged the federal government for building the Transcontinental Railroad. Company insiders distributed discounted stock to members of Congress to prevent investigation. A newspaper expose in 1872 triggered a congressional investigation. The investigation found what it was looking for. Several prominent political careers were damaged. Congressman Oaks Ames, who had personally distributed the stock, was censured by the House of Representatives. He died 2 months after the censure. Vice President Schuyler Colfax was implicated and did not seek re-election. Future President James Garfield was named as a recipient and spent years managing the political fallout. Nobody went to prison. The investigation concluded. The scandal faded. History moved on. That is the official story. And it is not wrong as far as it goes. What it doesn't go far enough to examine is the money itself, not the stock, not the dividends the stock paid, not the political influence that the stock distribution was designed to purchase, the actual extraction. The tens of millions of dollars that moved from federal bond guarantees through the Credit Mobilier accounts and out into private hands before the investigators arrived. Where that money went. What it built. Why the 2 congressional committees that examined the Credit Mobilier accounts in 1873 produced reports that identified the bribery mechanism with considerable precision and said almost nothing useful about the underlying financial extraction. That is the question the official story has never been required to answer. The official story begins in the years immediately following the Civil War. The Union Pacific Railroad had been authorized by Congress in 1862 to build the western half of the first transcontinental line. The project was of enormous strategic and commercial importance to the federal government. The country needed a rail connection between the East and the Pacific coast. The government was prepared to support the construction with substantial financial assistance. It authorized the issuance of government bonds to fund construction, with the bonds to be repaid from railroad revenues over time. It also authorized the grant of federal lands along the route, with the railroad receiving alternating sections on either side of the track as an additional incentive for completion. The total federal commitment to the Union Pacific alone eventually reached approximately $44 million in bond guarantees and more than 11 million acres of federal land. This was the public money. This was what Congress had appropriated and what the government had formally committed. What happened to it is where the official story and the financial reality diverge. A group of Union Pacific stockholders, recognizing that the real profit in railroad construction lay not in operating the completed railroad, but in the construction contracts themselves, created a separate company called the Credit Mobilier of America and arranged for that company to receive the construction contracts for the Union Pacific line. The men who owned Union Pacific also owned Credit Mobilier. They were awarding the construction contract to themselves, and they set the contract price at a figure that bore no relationship to the actual cost of construction. Independent engineers who examined the Credit Mobilier accounts after the scandal broke estimated that the actual construction cost for the Union Pacific line was somewhere between $50 and $60 million. Credit Mobilier was paid approximately $94 million. The difference, somewhere between $30 and $44 million, depending on which cost estimates you accept, was the extraction. The profit that flowed from the federal bond guarantees through the construction contract and into the private accounts of the men who had arranged the entire structure. In 1872, that was enough money to build a city, not a small frontier settlement, a functioning American city with commercial infrastructure, residential districts, public buildings, and enough capital remaining to sustain a decade of development. Now, here is where it gets strange. The congressional investigation that followed the 1872 exposé by the New York Sun was not a superficial examination. The Poland Committee and the Wilson Committee both had subpoena power, both called witnesses, both examined documents, both produced detailed reports, and both reports focused with remarkable consistency on the stock distribution, the bribery mechanism, while saying almost nothing about where the underlying extraction had gone. The Credit Mobilier books that investigators examined were described in the committee records as extraordinarily complex, multiple layers of subsidiary accounts, transactions recorded in ways that made it impossible to trace money from its origin to its destination without following a chain of intermediate steps through entities that existed only on paper. Payments categorized as construction expenses that corresponded to no documented construction activity. When investigators asked for supporting documentation for specific transactions, they were told that records had been lost or destroyed during a relocation of the company's offices. The timing of that relocation and the specific records that happened to be lost during it are not examined in either committee report. Oakes Ames was censured. He died 2 months later. And the inquiry effectively ended with his death, as though the man who had distributed the stock was also the man who had built the concealment architecture. He was not. The men who built the concealment architecture were still alive, still wealthy, and, in several cases, still in positions of public trust. Here is the detail that the official history of the Credit Mobilier scandal consistently passes over. Several of the men who were identified as recipients of Credit Mobilier stock or of direct payments from Credit Mobilier emerged from the investigation not merely unscathed, but substantially wealthier than they had been when the investigation began. Not from the stock. The stock payments and dividends were documented and their value was known. From other investments made during the same period whose funding sources were never examined by either congressional committee because those investments were not legally connected to Credit Mobilier, and the committees were examining Credit Mobilier. James Garfield received Credit Mobilier stock and was publicly embarrassed by the investigation. He was also re-elected to Congress, continued rising in the Republican Party, and was elected president in 1880. His personal financial records from the years between 1872 and 1876 show investments in Western land and railroad securities whose combined value substantially exceeded what his congressional salary could have funded. The source of those investment funds was not examined by the Poland Committee or the Wilson Committee. It was not within their mandate. Their mandate was the stock distribution, not what the men who received the stock did with the capital they had accumulated before the stock was ever issued. This is how financial concealment works when it is designed by people who understand the mechanisms of investigation. You structure the scheme so that the part that can be found is not the part that matters most. You make the bribery visible enough to satisfy the investigators who are looking for a story. You make the underlying extraction invisible by moving it before the investigation begins through entities and transactions that are several steps removed from anything the investigation has authority to examine. You cooperate fully with the investigation of the part that was designed to be found. And you watch as the investigation concludes and the money, the actual money, the tens of millions that came from federal bond guarantees and disappeared into private accounts, remains exactly where it was moved to before the investigators arrived. The Credit Mobilier principles had months of warning before the New York Sun published the exposé that triggered the investigation. The paper trail that would have connected the extracted capital to its destinations was months old by the time the Poland committee convened. In the interval between when the principals knew the investigation was coming and when the investigation actually began, assets moved. Records were relocated or lost. The books that investigators would examine were the books that remained. The books that documented where the money had gone were not among them. The 1890 census, destroyed in 1921, covered the period when the men who had extracted that capital were deploying it into the Western land and railroad investments that the post-war boom was making extraordinarily profitable. It documented the populations of the territories where that land was located. It recorded household compositions that would have allowed a researcher to trace the accumulation of assets by specific families against the documented sources of their wealth. It would have made visible, for anyone who thought to look, the gap between the publicly documented income of the Credit Mobilier principals and the assets they were accumulating in the same period. That census was destroyed before anyone developed the research framework to ask that question of its data. The congressional reports from the Poland Committee and the Wilson Committee are in the Library of Congress. They have been in the public domain for 150 years. The Credit Mobilier accounts, or the portions of those accounts that survived the company's records relocation, are held in private archives that have never been made available for independent research. The federal land records documenting the assets accumulated by Credit Mobilier principals in the years following the investigation are in the National Archives. Nobody has ever produced a comprehensive study connecting all three sets of records into a single accounting of where the extraction went. Maybe the extraction simply dispersed into the general flow of Gilded Age investment. Maybe the investments made by Credit Mobilier principals in the years after the investigation were funded by legitimate sources that happen not to have been documented clearly. Maybe the complexity of the Credit Mobilier accounts reflects the normal opacity of mid-19th century corporate finance rather than deliberately engineered concealment. Maybe the specific records that were lost in the company's office relocation would not have told a different story than the records that survived. But I keep returning to the arithmetic. Between $30 and $44 million moved from federal bond guarantees through the Credit Mobilier accounts and into private hands. 2 congressional investigations with subpoena power examined those accounts. Neither produced an accounting of where the money went. Neither produced a criminal conviction. Neither recovered a dollar. The scheme involved the Vice President of the United States, the future President of the United States, and more than a dozen sitting members of Congress. The investigation found the bribery. The bribery was designed to be found. The extraction was designed not to be, and it has not been. Not in 150 years of American historiography. Not by either congressional committee, not by any subsequent federal investigation, not by any academic study that has attempted to trace the full financial history of the Credit Mobilier scheme from the federal bond guarantee to its final destination. The railroad was built. The money came from the federal government. The money went somewhere. The records that would have documented where it went are the records that were lost during the office relocation. And the census that would have allowed researchers to reconstruct the destination from the other direction was destroyed before anyone thought to ask it that question. The investigation that was supposed to find the money stopped where the trail was designed to end, and the money is still wherever it was moved to before the investigators arrived. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.